you want to spread democracy for three reasons. One, to protect human rights across the world. Two, to cause international peace. And three, to protect liberalism at home. And again, all of this grows out of the emphasis on individualism and inalienable rights, as I'll make clear as we go along here. So let me start by talking about protecting human rights across the world. The basic argument is that people who live in a far-off country are no different than people who live in your country. Borders actually don't matter very much. Rights are of great importance, and everybody has rights. And when the rights of non-Americans are being threatened, Americans have a responsibility to do everything they can to protect those people whose rights are being violated. And of course, the most important right here is the right to life. If some foreign dictator is murdering large numbers of his or her people, the United States has a responsibility that grows out of this universalism to protect the rights of those individuals that are being violated. Now, this goes so far in the liberal discourse that you end up getting the argument that non-liberal governments are in a state of aggression with their own people. Just think about that statement. This is Michael Doyle, mainstream, prominent, liberal international relations theorist at Columbia University. He's basically saying non-liberal governments, no matter what they do, non-liberal governments are in a state of aggression with their own people. What happens here is that you go from a situation where you can use your military forces to intervene in different countries when there are gross violations of individual rights and fix the problem and then leave. You go from that more modest policy to one where you decide that the best way to protect rights is simply to turn another country into a liberal democracy. Because once it's a liberal democracy, the individual rights, which are privileged in liberalism, are protected by definition. So if you have a planet that is filled with nothing but liberal democracies, the problem of gross violations of human rights is simply taken off the table. If you merely just act like a fire department and you only intervene in those situations where you see rights being violated, you fix it, and then you get out, you don't ultimately solve the problem. So what this emphasis on protecting rights does, especially when it's taken in the form that Michael Doyle lays out, it leads to the belief that what you want to do is populate the planet with liberal democracies. Second reason to spread liberal democracy, it leads to international peace. Virtually everybody in this audience, I'm sure, knows all about democratic peace theory. Democratic peace theory is based on the basic liberal template involving rights and tolerance, right? It's the whole idea that people across the planet have a set of inalienable rights and that they tend to respect the rights of other individuals, right? And that leads to international peace, right? If you can spread democracy across the planet. In other words, if you create a world of all democracies, they're not going to fight against each other because people respect the rights of people in other countries and they're tolerant. The tolerance grows out of that emphasis on inalienable rights, as I talked about last time. This is basic democratic peace theory, and this is the basic liberal logic that underpins it. Right? Moreover, it solves the twin problems of nuclear proliferation and terrorism. Right? If you have peace, you don't need nuclear weapons. There's no need for nuclear weapons in a world where there's nothing but liberal democracies. And terrorism is certainly not going to be a problem, because in the liberal story, liberal states never engage in terrorism. It's always non-liberal states. So the idea is to create a world where they're just liberal democracies. And this is the rationale for invading Iraq. Sometimes people will say to me, John, how can you say that invading Iraq was based on a liberal theory? Well, the invasion of Iraq and the Bush doctrine more generally, as I'll make clear as we go along here, was based on the assumption that if you could go into Iraq, go into Iran, go into Syria, you could turn the greater Middle East into a sea of democracies. You could turn them into a sea of democracies, cause peace, there would be no nuclear proliferation, and there would be no terrorism. That's what they thought would be the end result. This is why the Bush administration thought that Al-Qaeda itself was not the problem. Al-Qaeda was part of the problem, but rogue states in the Middle East, rogue states meaning non-democracies that don't dance to America's tune, have to be turned into liberal democracies. So once that happens, then you turn the Middle East into a zone of peace. And oh, by the way, this is exactly what happened in Europe, according to the liberal story. Why do we have peace in Europe? Because it's filled with liberal democracies. And I'll talk more about this in the context of NATO expansion. They don't fight each other. You don't get terrorism. You don't get nuclear proliferation. Third, just on the business of international peace. What you also see in the literature on liberal democracy as a cause of peace is a tremendous emphasis on the word community, especially international community. You surely have all heard the word international community many times. International community is very much a liberal term. Think about the opposite of international. It's national. When the journal International Security was created, there was a huge debate about whether to call it national security or international security. And they called it international security, right? International, right? And it's the international community, giving you the sense that there are really no meaningful borders among the states that exist in that community. Those borders are very porous. We talk about the transatlantic community. We talk about the European community, the EC. We went from the European Steel and Coal Community to the European community to the European Union, right? But the European community. We talk about security communities, Karl Deutsch's famous term. Woodrow Wilson used to talk about communities of power, right? And of course, in these communities, you're not going to have any war. That's the basic argument. Third reason to spread liberal democracy is to protect liberalism at home. The fact is that virtually every liberal theorist understands that you're not going to convince every single person in a liberal society that liberalism is the ideal political system. And there's always a danger on the home front that there'll be a group that is powerful and will attempt to overthrow the liberal order. And what really scares liberals is the thought that that group on the home front will form an alliance with a foreign country. And that foreign country will help fuel revolution at home. Okay? So if you live in a world of all liberal democracies, that problem is taken off the table. That's reflected in Woodrow Wilson's famous words. He went before Congress on April 2nd, 1917, to ask for a declaration of war against Germany. And that's where he made his famous remarks that his aim was to help create a world that could be made safe for democracy. A world that could be made safe for democracy. Because he understood that liberal democracy sometimes exists in a tenuous state. Just to give you two other examples of this. The United States and the Red Scares after both World War I and during the early Cold War was the basic fear here? The basic fear was that there were communists in the United States, and those communists would ally with a communist state like the Soviet Union, and the end result of that would be trouble, if not revolution, on the home front. So if you can create a situation where you turn the Soviet Union into a liberal democracy, you turn communist China into a liberal democracy, you just take that problem right off the table. And think about the problem today from China and Russia's point of view. What China and Russia today fear is that liberal groups and individuals inside those countries who are unhappy with the likes of Vladimir Putin will ally with the United States to undermine the regime. You go to Moscow today, you go to Beijing today, they are really worried about regime change. As hard as that may be to believe, regime change instigated by the United States in an alliance with liberal forces inside their own countries. And again, if the United States was not a liberal country, this problem would be taken off the table. So, the underpinnings of liberal hegemony: emphasis on individualism plus inalienable rights gives it a powerful universalist impulse. And that impulse leads to a foreign policy committed to spreading liberal democracy around the world for those three reasons.